Last week, after our worship service, Charlie gave me an article from a newspaper, and it was this one about Desmond Tutu. And I'm sure you have seen a lot of pictures about the great Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Uh, I this is a good picture of him here as he's looking very thoughtful and hands folded, almost as if he is in prayer. And he may have lived his life this way, but he also lived his life with so much joy. And some of the great pictures that I have seen about from Desmond Tutu has been of him dancing, smiling, living his life with so much joy. And as I've reflected upon Desmond Tutu's life and on this article the last few weeks, as after Desmond Tutu's death on December 26th, I have kind of been in awe of this man's ability to deal with the oppression of the world with a sense of joy, as he carried joy along with him, the ability to laugh. And if you have ever heard Desmond Tutu's laugh, it is so infectious and joyful. And he's one of those people who I think, man, I would love to be a little more like him. Do you have those people in your life where you're like, ooh, this is a good model, a good person to model my life after? One of the reasons that this article, that Charlie gave me the article, as he gave it to me, he said, Adam, this article says one of your main points that you give us, which is that our religious tradition should lead us, should inspire us to engage in the world in efforts to make it a better place. And that includes politics. You see, for Desmond Tutu, it wasn't as if religion had nothing to say about politics. For Desmond Tutu, religion had everything to say about politics. Politics is merely how we live our lives with one another, and religion for Desmond Tutu should inspire us to live our lives with one another in a way that is more loving, that seeks the good of the other, that seeks a more just and loving world. Here are a few quotes from the article. Tutu lived his faith each day, and this went beyond saying prayers or doing good deeds and leading in worship services. It meant risking his life to challenge injustice, risking his life to challenge the political injustice of his day. For Tutu, this was primarily seen in South Africa in apartheid. Apartheid is the South African word that literally means aparthood. It was a system of white supremacy that we know plenty about, or we should know plenty about here in the United States. Apartheid separated the white minority from the black majority and gave white people power over and against the black majority. It was an abusive, violent system, much like racism continues to exist here in the United States. Desmond Tutu entered into this political system and he said, this is not right, and we need to transform it. Whenever religious leaders would come to Desmond Tutu and say, hey, you just need to stay out of politics, Desmond Tutu would refer to the story of the Exodus, the great story in the Bible where God inspires Moses to go to the political leader of Egypt, the Pharaoh, and call out the Pharaoh and say, let my people go from oppression. And Desmond Tutu would ask this question: when God delivers a bunch of slaves out of bondage in Egypt, is that a political or a religious act? Of course, the answer is yes. That is a political and a religious act, because God is on the move for more freedom, more justice, and more love in the world. That is how Desmond Tutu lived his life. And frequently for Desmond Tutu, that meant non-violent civil disobedience in the face of government oppression. Can I get an amen in the chat section? This is how Desmond Tutu lived his life, and he did it with joy. Why? Why do we find so many Black leaders, whether in South Africa, whether in the United States, living their lives with this radical commitment to justice and also this joyful infection? Martin Luther King Jr., who we will celebrate next week, also lived his life with this radical nonviolent civil disobedience and with joy. How did they do it? In part because they knew that God was on the side of justice. God was leading the way like God led Moses in Egypt. God was leading the way against injustice and oppression and towards more love and more compassion and more mercy in the world. Desmond Tutu, before the fall of the apartheid system, gave a speech where the government was trying to oppress him and his movement. And he gave his laugh during the speech and he said, "You guys have already lost. You're losing. You're not gonna win." Why? Because Desmond Tutu knew that the power of God was the power of justice and the power of love. And that led him to the spirit of joy and confidence that the world is moving in the right direction, that we can participate with God in moving in a more joyful, a more just, and a more loving world. That is the inspiration of Desmond Tutu's life, and he got it from within the biblical story. Not only the story of the Exodus, but also the story that we have today. The two stories, one from Isaiah chapter 60 that George read and introduced to us so beautifully. Isaiah and his people had just been destroyed and decimated, conquered by the Babylonian Empire. And they'd been spread throughout the Babylonian Empire. And Isaiah speaks into a time where there is the hope of reconciliation. Isaiah, in his words, says that nations from all around the world, instead of being spread out throughout the world, are going to come to Jerusalem. And they're going to bring their glory. And they're going to share their God-given glory with one another. You see, the way that Desmond Tutu challenged the system of the world, the way that Isaiah is challenging the system of the world, is that when we suffer through violence, persecution, Desmond Tutu and Isaiah are offering the alternative, which is non-violent civil disobedience and the hope of reconciliation. Isaiah says that in this moment where we have just suffered loss and have been conquered, how are we going to make the world a better place? How are we going to let God's light shine in the world? It is by providing the alternative. It is not by seeking revenge. It is by rising up against unjust systems and showing the world a different way. Isaiah's whole system is going against the way that the world divides all of us humans up into good guys and bad guys. Isaiah is saying we are going to wash that away. When we talk about sin in Christianity, the number one sin that Isaiah is trying to move us away from, that Jesus tries to move us away from as well, is the sin of dividing the world up into good guys and bad guys, and we just have to defeat the bad guys and the world will be a better place. You know what happens when we live our lives that way? We continue to find bad guys to try to destroy. As Paul would say later, our fight, our struggle is not with flesh and blood, but with powers and principalities. So what Isaiah is trying to do in chapter 60 is move us away from uniting in hostility against a common enemy and inviting people in as they are, in all of their God-given glory, that we might live a life of reconciliation and restoration and mutual love with one another. Now, obviously, as I'm saying this, and if you are hearing this and there have been people who have hurt you in your life and it's not safe to be with them, obviously we need to put up barriers and boundaries with those people. Part of loving our neighbor as we love ourselves is making sure that we love ourselves enough to put up boundaries between us and those who have hurt us. Sometimes to love our neighbor means loving them from a distance. And maybe hoping for a day of restoration in the future. In the story of Matthew, of the Magi, we see the Magi are priests from the East, probably Zoroastrian priests. They are magicians. In Acts chapter 13, it uses the word Magi, and many translations translate it as sorcerers. These Magi are sorcerers. They are astrologers. These are people that many Christians would demonize, maybe even call satanic. But guess what? God works through them too. Here we find the complete destruction of an us against them mentality. People from other religions have God too? That's what this story is saying. God works through them. God works through astronomers. God works through astrology. God works through sorcerers. God works through witches. Can I get an amen in the chat section? We cannot contain God in our small, tiny religion that we call Christianity, or in our small, tiny book, no matter how great it is, that we call the Bible. God cannot be contained in that because God is so much bigger. God shows up in the stars. God shows up in the mountains. God shows up in something as small as a blade of grass. If we have eyes to see, like these Magi, these sorcerers do from the East. And so they follow the star and they find God manifested in the star, which leads them to God manifested in this Christ child. And on their journey, they encounter a man named King Herod. And they get wind that King Herod is out to keep power in the way that the world often tries to keep power, through violence. And how do these Magi, these Zoroastrian priests, respond? In the same way that Desmond Tutu responded, with nonviolent civil disobedience. These Magi say no to political oppression. They say no to political violence. They refuse to be co-opted by violent politicians that want to keep their power through the threat of violence or through more violence. They rise up and they say no. These Magi, Isaiah, Desmond Tutu, give us great examples for the political oppression of our day as well. The continued racism that infects the United States, as Donna keeps reminding us, the voting oppression that we need to end through the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. We need to rise up and do what we can. We're often asked, what can I do in the face of political oppression? It's hard to know. It's hard to know. But one of the things that we can do is name it, is name the ways that politicians today continue to want to hold on to power through unjust voting systems that we see happening, trying to be implemented throughout the United States. Desmond Tutu rose up against those unjust systems in South Africa. And maybe it's time that on social media, within our family, we begin to name these things all the more and try to inspire our politicians to vote in things like the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. Maybe it's time to talk to our neighbors a little more about that unjust system that continues to weed its way into and throughout the United States. Maybe it's time to find other ways that we can do this too, to brainstorm together ways that we can fight the injustice that continues to come about. Ways to, one of the things that Desmond Tutu did as well with the government that he helped install, he saw that that government continued to create armaments to prepare for war, to continue to trust in weapons of war. And Desmond Tutu rose up against even Nelson Mandela, who wanted more, who produced more weapons and said, this is not the way to go. Maybe it's time for us to be more vocal about rising up against the fact that the United States continues to outspend all other countries when it comes to military armaments, and say there are better ways that we can use our tax dollars, that we can use our funds to help those who are most in need. These and so many other ways that you can come up with are ways that we can move in the footsteps of Desmond Tutu and of Isaiah and of the wise, I was going to say wise men, of the Magi. In acts of civil disobedience, in acts that seek to make the world a better place, not by finding a common enemy, but by enacting more love and more justice into the world. May we do so today and forevermore. Amen.